Hello, Houston. We're sitting here madly scrambling to make sure that we've got the correct screen to put on for you, and we're pretty close to being ready to do that, which I think is going to look about like that. So that's where we're going to start today, is the processing of language. And in essence, relative to that, we're going to start out with a model that I think I had just barely gotten you to last time, and that is this one. The basic idea behind this model as a description of what goes on in language is to kind of counteract a model that existed for many years, which was advocating that language is basically a serial processing task. It doesn't turn out to be true. Basically, when you and I talk to one another, we are actually engaged in what is called parallel processing. That is, we are simultaneously processing the sound that we are exchanging back and forth. We are processing the syntax or the organization of the units that we're talking about, and we're talking about the meaning that is associated with the individual units. We're going to talk about each of those a little bit, but the model that you have on the screen there now kind of represents the modern day thinking about what actually is going on when we are communicating with each other. And that is that, in essence, you and I are very good parallel distributors, or that we engage in what's called distributed parallel processing. We are processing language simultaneously at the level of sound, at the level of meaning, and at the level of the structure of the sentence that's being used to communicate. So all three of those are going on simultaneously. The consequence of that is that when you and I are in an argument with somebody, as soon as we finish speaking, they start. And if they drag it out the least little bit, you'll jump in with the last word they were going to say so that you can get started, because we have processed right with them, and when they finish, we're with them and ready to jump on to whatever our point was going to be. Now, when we get into processing, you get into something a little bit different. Have you ever said to somebody, "Do you know what time it is?" And they look back at you and say, "Yeah." And then there's this long, pregnant pause, and you finally say, "Well?" And they assure you, "Yes, I do know what time it is. I know exactly what time it is." And then you have to go through laboriously and say, "Well, if you know what time it is, would you mind telling me what time it is? Would you actually tell me what time it is?" And then they'll get around and say, "Oh, I'm sorry. Didn't realize you wanted to know the time. You just asked me whether I knew it." And of course, that kind of literal translation never occurs. We just don't have that conversation. Because when you say to somebody, "Do you know what time it is?" you're not literally asking them a question that you and I would answer yes or no. You're asking them essentially, "If you know what time it is, please tell me." Okay? There is, in other words, a lot of kind of understanding, if we want to use that word, built into the way in which we use our language. And today what I want to try and do is kind of break this down a little bit into the components that allow you and I to actually establish that basis for understanding. In essence, one of the first things that we study then is sound. It is not true that individual words could be identified if we could just see a visual representation of our speech. That is painful to listen to. It's painful for me to say. And the reason is, as you could hear, that in essence what I did was to delineate precisely the end of each word. Okay? There was a pause, a pause, a pause. We don't have that. If you've ever walked along following behind somebody who's speaking French, it sounds like they're right on the verge of throwing up constantly. But in essence, what they're doing is enunciating a continuing stream of uninterrupted sound. Or it's modified, but it's uninterrupted. It is a constant stream of any major language, whether it's Vietnamese or English or Spanish, you name it. It's essentially a continuously uttered series of sounds which are interrupted or modified slightly to change the intonation and the meaning of what we're actually trying to say to somebody. So in essence, when we look at the study of sound, what we're going to look at, first of all, relative to language, is phonology. And phonology is basically the discipline, the science that looks at the actual manner of how we go about combining sounds, forming them, and then combining them into units to understand what's going on. So we're primarily interested here in what are called phonemes, which are the most basic elements of language itself. This is a diagram we could only produce once we had computers. And in essence, what this diagram shows is the time during which a frequency is actually represented. So you've got time on the x-axis and presence of frequency reflected on the y-axis. And what it shows here, if you look at what we see when we say a statement or a sentence, a phrase like "to catch pink salmon," is the fact that it takes a little over a second to say that. But one of the surprising things is that the gap near the end of catch, right here, I don't know whether you can see the arrow on the screen, but the gap at about 0.4 seconds is almost as long as the one between N and K when you're saying pink. And so you can't use the gaps as a marker of words. You have to look instead at you have to actually hear the word itself. The other thing I want to point out here before we go on is notice that there is one great concentration of frequencies here at around, and I'm going to guesstimate about 3,600 cycles per second. That's kind of the center here. Excuse me. There's a second one down here in this range, which goes all the way across the screen, and that's down around, say, 21 or 2,200 cycles per second. And you'll notice there's a third concentration down around here, down around 600 or 700 or 800 cycles per second. Those three bands of sound are what are called formants, F-O-R-M-A-N-T-S. And it turns out somebody with a computer thought to him or herself, well, hey, why don't we play just those sounds? Let us play frequencies just at those frequencies and see what happens. And sure enough, they created a chording structure where in essence they played, for this particular speaker, tones around 700 or 800 cycles per second, another tone around 21, 2,200 cycles per second, and a third one up around 3,500 or 3,600 cycles per second. If they sounded only those three tones, and over the timeline had the tone actually on only when this diagram indicates, or I should say this diagram, indicates that it should be on, and you listen to it, and they tell you it's computer music, then you can roll along very nicely with it as computer music. But as soon as they tell you, if you listen carefully, there's actually a spoken message in there. Instantly, almost all of us can hear the language. That is, we can take just those three formants and convert it back into a spoken message. Another thing related to that is that those three basic frequencies, the three basic formants, turn out to be in a ratio that is a constant across all speakers. If you have somebody who has a very high squeaky voice, what happens is that the range in this graph expands upward, but the ratio of the lowest to the middle to the highest formant is identical. In the same way, there's an announcer right now here in Houston on KUHF, the university station, whose voice is so low that I can't even mimic it. It's a marvelous radio voice, but he's way down here. When he talks, it almost sounds like he's going to swallow himself when he's on Saturday night when he's talking. For him, those three formants are still there. It's just they're very compressed. So the highest one for him, I would guess, is probably down around, I'm guessing, but I would say probably around 2,000 cycles. He has a surprisingly low yet very clear voice. So the point is the formants and that ratio are the same. They're just spread further for somebody that has a higher voice. But they seem to be very important in communication, a basic to communication itself. Another way in which sound is important is the fact that when we group words together, we actually create a kind of a semantic link or a sound link between the words. And it turns out you and I really communicate the meaning of any given thought, not in any one word, but in several words. Here's a case of some results that were generated out of an experiment in which these investigators recorded on very, very high-speed tape a 9-word sentence, and what sentence it is really doesn't matter. But what they did was to take the 30 or 35 feet of tape that were generated over about 2 or 3 seconds in pronouncing this sentence and stretch it out and then analyze it electronically so that they could sever and separate exactly at the point where the person shifted from one word to the next word. So basically they unitized the tape into 9 individual slices of words, and then they would combine them anywhere from 1 to 9 words and play them for other participants and ask them to identify what was actually said. One of the surprising things in these results is that if you're only given one word out of those 9 when it's in a continuing flowing sentence, the odds are only about 50-50 that you're going to hear it and identify it correctly. So the point is that combining words together greatly increases our accuracy in identifying any one word. All right? That is, the sound flow is part of the total message that is communicated. Another thing that's also important in sound, and in this case we're actually talking about the absence of sound, but it is a sound factor, is where I put the pause completely alters what you understand me to say when I make a sentence, when I say to you something like, I saw the girl with the telescope. If I put the pause near the beginning, I saw the girl with the telescope, then I'm looking at some youngster who's standing some distance away, next to or with or beside a telescope. But on the other hand, if I say to you instead, I saw the girl, pause, with the telescope, now I'm standing in the North Tower here at the U of H looking across to somebody in the South Tower through the telescope. And the difference in interpretation there is purely based on where we put the pause. The sentence itself is unchanged. Okay? So it's the pause that actually alters the communication here. Emphasis is another thing that alters what we mean. If I give you a very innocuous sentence like I want you to do it and don't emphasize any one, you don't quite know what my position on that really is. But I could say to you, I want you to do it. That's me as opposed to my department chair or the teaching assistant or something like that. I could say, I want you to do it. That's want as opposed to being wishy-washy about it. I am really committed to having you do it. I want you to do it. That's you as opposed to my 9 a.m. class or my 11 a.m. class or whatever. I want you to do it as opposed to not doing it. We could even say, I want you to do it. And I'll leave it to your imagination as to what it happens to be. But in each case, by changing what I stress, it alters what you understand me to be saying in this situation. Syntactics is a second factor which very much impacts how we understand words. And syntactics actually is an order effect. There are many different rules as to how we actually combine the lessons, the meaning in our language, okay? How we combine the words to achieve meaning in our language. One of the simplest ways is to study this is to study morphology, which is basically looking at the actual mechanisms by which we combine sounds into meaningful units. And a meaningful unit can even be something like adding an S at the end of a word to pluralize it. So it doesn't necessarily have to be words, although we normally think about it as being words. But here's an example. This is a hyph. Now there's another one. There are two hyphs, okay? And in this instance, what you've done is to use the s form of pluralization, okay? That is, we're simply adding s to cups to pluralize it. There's more than one. This is a wug. Now there's another one. There are two of them. There are two wugs. Now you're using the z sound to pluralize. Now you think to yourself, well, at some point you learn how to pluralize. Doesn't turn out to be so, because there's a third way in which we can traditionally pluralize English. First graders, about 85% of them will do these two pluralizations correctly without any problem. It isn't until 6th grade that 85% of the students can do the third kind correctly, which is, this is a gutch. Now there's another one. There are two gutches. And now, in fact, we've pluralized it using the is sound. You listen to the average 4th grader say that two circuses are in town, and it's your guess as to how they're going to pluralize circus, because they cannot typically do the is pluralization correctly. So this is something that they learn gradually. That's an order effect, however. It's a morphology effect. It's a learning to combine sounds to create particular meanings that is involved. The same thing happens with words. Words have a number of different ways in which we can study them conceptually. One of the traditional ways to divide words, and this is not used as often anymore, but I think it's important because it makes a couple of important distinctions about words. One of them is to divide words into what are called content words as opposed to function words. Okay? The content words are also sometimes referred to as an open class. And by open, what's meant is that we can add words to the open class. AOK, an example I've used previously here, came into the language pool from NASA. When NASA first started launching rockets with people aboard, one of the ways in which the onboard astronauts communicated very efficiently that all the dials were in the optimal range was to say it's AOK. And AOK was then folded into our standard vocabulary. And when things are okay with us, you will sometimes hear somebody say things are AOK. There are several other examples I could cite for you. I'll use the more diplomatic one to suggest that about 5 or 10 years ago, a new phrase came into the language which had to do with the fact that you've got your stuff together. Your stuff is okay. Now that doesn't normally mean that you take your stuff and deliberately package it into neatly chunked elements. Okay? It means simply that things are okay for you. Okay? Your stuff was together when you got up this morning. Well, that means that the dress or pants you were going to put on was where you expected it to be. You found your watch where you took it off last night. There was toothpaste and so forth. So that we say simply your stuff is together. It's not really literally talking about mechanical or concrete things. It's just talking about life was okay in that case. And you can think of other ways in which that can be expressed. But that's another example of a noun which was added to the vocabulary basically from teenagers. I mean, that came out of teenage language pool originally. But the content words are basically nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. We add to those all the time. And in some cases, we edit out and don't use words in that class any longer. The function words, on the other hand, and I've only listed some of them here. They're all listed in Simple Psych. The function words are also sometimes identified as a closed class. And what's meant by that is basically that this is a set of words that are not going to change during our lifetime. The National Organization for Women, in its first major error, and I don't mean to imply they've done many, but in an error that they made early on as an organization, they set about to neutralize English. The problem being, as you know, that English is not gender neutral. That all other things being equal, when you're making a general statement about a person does this, that, or the other thing, the tradition is normally to say he. He did this, he did that, even though it's not really sex relevant to say he in that case. It's just the general identifier. Well, what they set about to do was actually to alter the language so that you had a gender neutral word. And it was a total failure. And the reason was that what they were trying to do was to change the function words of the class. They were trying to change the pronouns, which are a closed class. They are not going to change during my lifetime and very unlikely to do so during your time. Those are that's the mortar in the brick wall of language, if you want to think about it that way. It's really crucial for the language to operate properly, even though most of the information is communicated by the content words, and we have a huge array of those. The function words, the closed word class, is a very limited and tightly constricted class of words. Now, we have a couple of different rule systems that we use in putting language together. One of these is what's called phrase structure rules or grammar. Those are the rules by which we generate sentences. One of the simplest, in fact, the most basic rule in terms of phrase structure grammar is sentence equals noun phrase plus verb phrase. That's the statement of a declarative sentence in English. It's a noun phrase and a verb phrase, pure and simple. Now we have to specify what do we mean by a noun phrase. Well, a noun phrase is a determiner plus a noun. A verb phrase, then, is a verb plus a noun phrase. Already we've seen a way in which the language will open up, okay? Because now we can make noun phrase be a determiner and a noun phrase, or we can make it be a determiner and a noun. In this instance, to keep the example simple, I'm simply going to spell out noun phrase to mean determiner plus noun, as we did a minute ago. And we can then generate an exemplary sentence, an exemplar sentence, very easily. The boy kissed the girl. After which word would you be most likely to expect a pause in that sentence, in that specific sentence? After which word would you most likely expect a normal speaker to pause? After boy. Okay? In other words, it makes perfect sense for me to, it doesn't make you at all uncomfortable if I say to you, the boy kissed the girl. And that pause is not a problem for you. Where could I put a secondary pause? After which word might you find a lesser pause? After kissed. So again, it wouldn't deeply inconvenience you if I were to say the boy kissed the girl. But how annoying if I said to you, the boy kissed the girl. That pause is intolerable. It's anti-English. It's aggressive in some way. Because what's happened there is that in terms of the rule system that I'm using to process and that you're using to process, by the time I get to the last noun, there is in most conversation a very limited array of things that I'm likely to be able to conclude the thought with. For instance, in the sentence that I'm in the middle of right now, as you're processing, it's getting down to the point where I'm going to eventually come to the end of this sentence, and by the time I reach that last word, exactly as if you're in an argument with somebody, you can pretty well fill in, given context, what that last word is going to have to, and in that case, it has to be a verb, because it was an infinitive that I was using, to be. Okay? So in essence, we don't tolerate pauses between thee and girl in that particular sentence. What's being reflected there, here's an example of what I was talking about the other day when I talked about the saber-toothed tiger. Psycholinguists look at the finished product, the boy kissed the girl, and then use that and the order in which the words were produced, the way in which they were emphasized, where the pauses occurred, to read backward as to how it was that the person generated that sentence originally. Okay? And in essence, the pause is one of the things we look at, but we're essentially looking at the finished product and then trying to use that to generate from it the rule system that was used to originally produce it. In this case, among other things, the rule system tells us not only where the major split is, where the major time lag is likely to be, but also where a secondary one is tolerable. What's happening there is that the processor is going through a switch, a change, because in essence, once you finish the noun phrase in a declarative sentence, the load on short-term memory is reduced. And therefore what happens is there's a reshuffling of the rule maker. And now all you have to be concerned with is, okay, I've done the noun phrase, I only need to do a verb phrase. Once the verb is dispensed with, you have then only noun phrase or phrases still to add. And again, the load on memory has been further reduced, so that you can tolerate a secondary shift there, because we understand at some gut level that in fact the speaker is reorganizing his thought, see, I just did it by slip there, his or her thought processes as they're going through and manufacturing the sentence they are. I'll anticipate one of my points here a little bit later, and that is that when you and I are generating a sentence, such as I'm in the midst of right now, we are normally processing only about 3 or 4 words ahead of what we're actually saying. Witness the fact that if I make a sound transposition, what's called a spoonerism, it is never the case that in a 25-word sentence, a word from the last of the sentence is switched with a word sound at the beginning of the sentence. When a sound transposition occurs, it only bridges about 1 or 2 or 3 words, suggesting that that's about how far ahead of ourselves we are, so that the sentence that I'm in the midst of right now is being literally constructed on the fly in the same way that you are deconstructing it or translating it yourself, only about 2 or 3 words behind where I'm actually talking at any given point. Now, this is a concept that's a little difficult to introduce. You never quite know where to put it, but I guess it fits here about as well as anywhere. Relative to those phrase structure rules that we were talking about, Chomsky wrote a very important paper about 40 years ago now, in which he was basically trying to make a distinction between surface structure and deep structure. By surface structure, what he's talking about is what I'm saying right now. That is, the surface structure for you and I is the end product of linguistic processing. When I make a decision to write something down, what I write down is the surface structure. What I say to you is the surface structure. It is generated by, according to Chomsky, what he calls the deep structure. That was widely misunderstood to mean simply sentence rules, but it's much broader than that. What it really involves is, probably the easier way to identify it is to think about it as intended meaning. And it is therein that we can describe something like puns. Puns are an example of a situation where there's a slip between the meaning at the deep structure level and the anticipated meaning or the heard meaning at the surface level. Classic example, a number of years ago at the Republican convention in 1964 when Barry Goldwater was nominated for their presidential candidate, the Republicans got themselves a great big billboard across from the main entrance to the Coliseum in which the Republican convention was being held, and it said simply, "Goldwater is right." And the Democrats hired themselves a sign right next to it which said, "Yes, far right." And in essence, the point there was that they were putting a different deep structure spin on the received message. That is, they converted it into an assertion that he was an extreme conservative, which he was. And what the positioners of the original sign had been trying to communicate was that he was correct. Not that he was politically extreme, but that he was correct. But by adding that far right, what the Democrats did was to put a different spin on, or a reception of spin is another example of a word that has been added to our vocabulary of late. But in essence, in that case, what you did was to get people to switch or at least consider the other possibility at the deep structure level. Same thing that happens in a pun. The other real system that we need to worry about is what's called transformational grammar, transformational or rewrite rules, which we also need. These are important in a different way. In essence, in this case, what we're dealing with is a set of rules that involve, and I'll give you some examples here. When I do a declarative sentence, the simplest declarative sentence, something like, "You solved those problems." That's my simple declarative sentence. But I can put a lot of different emphases on that sentence, depending on which thought I really want to leave with you. These are the basic rules. We've talked about these a little bit, but let me just spell them out for you here. In transformational rewrite grammar, I might identify for you the fact that a subject can be a noun, a pronoun, or a noun phrase. A predicate can be a verb or a verb phrase, and then we can expand a noun phrase to be either a determiner or a noun. And as soon as you do that, you then begin to expand the possibilities of what can be a noun phrase. A verb phrase, and I'm sorry, it's the next one. A verb can be, a verb phrase can be a verb plus a noun phrase. As soon as we do that, as soon as we say noun phrase, we then flip back to the left side of the rule system and we can start adding further examples. We can expand what we mean by noun phrase. So that's where the language becomes more open-ended. We could add things like adjective phrases, prepositional phrases, and so forth in the rule system, but to keep it simple here, let me then just fill out with examples of what I mean by determiners, what I mean by nouns and verbs, and as soon as we do that, we've got enough to actually generate a sentence and then start transforming it in a variety of different ways. So in essence, if I give you a sentence like, you solved those problems, I can then turn it into a passive by saying those problems were solved by you. No thoughts have been added. The words have simply been altered by case or by positioning to turn it into a passive sentence. I can negate it by simply negating the verb. You didn't solve those problems. I can combine the two and make it a passive negative. Those problems weren't solved by you, and so forth. So we can turn it into a question. We can make it a statement of command, or we can make it a statement of surprise. There's a difference between when the judge at a NASCAR race says to the winner, you win, as opposed to, the garage mechanic who rushes up to the driver and says, you win. There's a difference there between an exclamation of authority as opposed to an expression of surprise, even though the sentence is exactly the same. Those are the differences in the deep structure that we're talking about. And that's one of the reasons that sometimes when somebody says something to you, you don't have a clue what they're saying, because your deep structure just doesn't overlap with the one that they're using to generate it. So they have to talk more. They have to say, well, what I mean by that is, and then they're just giving you more bases to understand the way in which they generated the sentence. Thirdly, we can look at semantics. We can look at the meaning that we actually attach to the individual words. And as you might expect, that meaning can be changed in a wide variety of different ways. For instance, words gain meaning, first of all, purely through convention. That is, there's nothing uniquely armness about this apparatus. We have just agreed as a speaker of English, as speakers of English, that that's an arm. There's nothing uniquely catness about cats or dogness about dogs. We've just agreed that's what we call those objects. And that's what allows us to have a dictionary. Were it not for convention, a dictionary would not be possible. The meaning of any given word would be tied entirely to the village in which the language is being used, or maybe even the family unit. For instance, my son, who's now early 30s, when he was 3 and we moved into Houston, we went to Galleria the very first night. My then wife and I and our 2 children went to Galleria to eat the first night at a Mexican restaurant there. And my son, at age 3, didn't yet have a mouth that fully functioned, and so when he heard the word Galleria, he started pronouncing it Gallerina, I-N-A instead of I-A. And that got folded into our vocabulary. So when any 2 of the 4 of us are together and we refer to the Gallerina, we know that we're making fun of his language twist from 27, 28 years ago, but it's part of that pool only. Gallerina would not mean the same thing to anybody else. That's a convention that works only within our immediate family. Secondly, meaning can be assigned. We did that last time with zebra. We took concepts you knew and assigned a new meaning to a concept like zebra that you might not previously have known. It's done in math anytime you let x equal. You're assigning meaning. A third is to provide meaning by context. If I were to say to you that I want you to give me an associate to the third word, I could say to you, Chablis, Sauterne, Port, and the context there suggests that it's a wine that I'm talking about, and yet in the same context I could instead say ship, ocean, port. And now you're thinking about harbor or boats or something like that. The context is what's provided it. If you say to somebody, she looks cool, that's a word that was in my vocabulary in high school back in the mid-50s. It cycled back through in the 90s. It was part of adolescent vocabulary more briefly that time. But when you talked to somebody and said he or she looked cool, what you were talking about was they looked attractive. They had their stuff together, if you want to use another lingo. Okay, another lingo. But in essence, context would suggest that if you saw such a person on the beach in a bathing suit and said she looks cool, you meant she looks attractive. But if you saw her on the ski resort at the end of the day with icicles hanging off her scarf, you're more likely then to be talking about her body temperature rather than her attractiveness. So the context can be very important. Meaning is also responsible for, and inflection is also a way in which we can impart meaning. For instance, it's a compliment to somebody to say, "What a pretty dress. How did you ever do it?" And that's a real compliment. But what if we emphasize you? How did you ever do it? Now we've insulted them. The words are the same, but the meaning, as you can see, is totally different. My absolute favorite example of this was brought in by a student several years ago. Now this is clearly correct. Woman without her man is nothing, right? Obvious source of celebration. But now let's take those same words and intone them in a slightly different way. Woman, without her, man is nothing. Same 6 words. Oh, now all the women are going, yeah, yeah. We did this one time on live interactive broadcast, and when this example came up, because I use it in the language course also, literally, by the time I'd gotten done with the second reading, one lady was on the phone immediately, "Well, which is it?" As if there's an answer, and of course there isn't. But the point is a linguistic one here, and that is with those same 6 words, we have completely done a 180 on the meaning by simply changing the emphasis. So in some cases, although the language is totally unchanged, the stress, the emphasis, the inflection is what really conveys what you're trying to say in that given situation. That one is just such a total 180 that I really like it as an example. Now, there are a number of things that meaning is exclusively responsible for. This is not a syntactic factor. It's not a phonology factor at all. It has a phonemic factor. It has only to do with meaning. Why is it an anomaly if I say to you, his typewriter had bad intentions? And that is because a typewriter is an inanimate object and it cannot intend anything. So the meaning of typewriter is basically what forces that to be. It's the meaning of typewriter that makes that into an anomaly. We can't explain that yet, but that's a fact. Why is it ambiguous if I say to you, John was looking for the glasses? Oh, we don't know. Was he looking for something to serve fluids in, or was he looking for something to look through? And without more explanation, we don't know. But the ambiguity there resides in the meaning of the word glasses. Why is it a self-contradiction if I say to you, my sister is an only child? That can't be, okay? If she's my sister, she can't be an only child because sister implies the existence of another human, whether it's male or female. And so again, it's in the meaning of the word sister. Why is it synonymous if I say to you, which one did I put up next? Entailment. Why is it entailing? If I say to you, many in the group were unable to answer your question, that entails the fact that only a few in the group grasped your question. Okay, the one entails the other because of the meaning attached to the first sentence. And why is it synonymous if I say to you, the needle is too short, that what I've also said simultaneously is the needle is not long enough. The one implies the other or is synonymous with the other. All of those distinctions are things that have to be conveyed using the meaning of the material itself. Now, if we look at spoken language, one of the questions we then run into, which is an important one, is what is required for spoken language? And the answer is that there are several answers. There are several things that are required. One is brain capabilities. We know that there are several different areas of the brain which, if impaired, result in the absence of language. We also know that when we measure brain activity, there are several different areas of the brain which are active when somebody is in the act of listening and speaking. In general, I won't spell them out in detail for you here, but if you can see the arrow on the screen, it's in this general area of the brain that most of language processing is going on. We are hearing in this area, we are enunciating in this area, and in essence what we are doing is using very complex series of interactions along tracks linking several different sites right on the side center of the head here that are involved in the production of language. So brain capability is one. We need a motor cortex to control the vocal cords. We need an auditory cortex to be able to process the incoming verbal information. We need an associative cortex to store the words. And we need the interconnections between them so that those systems can interact with each other and adjust depending on the incoming information. The second thing we need is to have a speech mechanism. Okay? our vocal cords specifically. The vocal cords are basically responsible, and the associated mouth apparatus are basically responsible, first of all, for vowels. The vowels are the easiest sounds to produce. You just get everything out of the way and vocalize. A, E, I, O, and U involve shaping the mouth to influence what sound comes out. But in fact, there is no interruption of the airflow at all. There's no hissing or anything. It's an open channel sound that we get. Contrast that with the consonant sounds, because there you've got the lips and mouth that are utilized to produce several different kinds of sounds. The lips are used to produce sounds like F and V. Lips and teeth, I should say, are used to pronounce these sounds. The plosive sounds are very different. There, either the tongue or the teeth and or the lips are used to just momentarily block the air and then release it. And in that case, we have at least 5 candidates I can suggest to you. B, D, K, P, and T are examples of plosive sounds. And what I mean by that is that the airflow is just momentarily blocked and then released. You cannot hold the sound of B. Your head would explode. Because all you've done basically is to exhale and block it just momentarily with your lips. B. Same with P. With T, on the other hand, it's actually your teeth and your tongue jammed against the roof of your mouth. But in all of those cases, the airflow is blocked, however briefly, and then released. And that puff is what produces the particular sound. We've got nasal sounds like and n. And then we've got the difference between voiced and non-voiced sounds. If you notice, when you say the letters F and V, the shape of your mouth and teeth is identical. The positioning of them relative to each other is identical. The difference is, if you feel your vocal cords, you vocalize on the V. That is, you can feel the vocal cords vibrating when you say V. You don't hear it when you say F, because then the mouth is shaped the same, but the vocal cords are not vibrating. Same difference between S and Z. It's the difference between a voiced and a non-voiced. The Z and the V are voiced. The F and the S are non-voiced. They're not vocalized when we say them. What is the easiest of all vowels to produce? Something even easier than schwa or and that's ah. Ah is what the doctor says when you've got a cold. She wants to look at your throat. They are telling you to open your mouth as wide as possible and get everything out of the way. So you say ah. There's no constriction when you're saying ah. What's the easiest consonant to produce? If you say ah and shut your mouth, you are saying right. No great surprise then that one of the most commonly used worldwide words to identify mother is mama. It is the 2 simplest sounds to produce manufactured, mama. In Tamil, an Indian language, it's actually the reverse, amma. But the effect is exactly the same. It's the 2 easiest consonants to produce, consonant and vowel combination to produce. We men, by contrast, are identified by a much more technically complex, sophisticated word like papa. Because for our children to identify us, they have to not only be able to go ah and which they can do easily for mom, they have to actually be able to constrict the airflow and understand the importance of releasing it to do something like papa. So to label us, they've really got to be sophisticated organisms, clearly. I tease. But in essence, there is some good logic. I would stand behind my assertion about mama. That one of the reasons that's used is because regardless of the history of father, mom is almost always going to be there. And the 2 easiest sounds to combine then logically would become identified with identifying her. The third thing we need is abstract reasoning. This, I'm going to argue, of the 4 that I'm going to cite, is by far the most important. And let me show you why. Helen Keller was born about a century ago now. Very shortly after birth, it was discovered that she was deaf, she could not hear, she was blind, she could not see, and ultimately it was demonstrated that she was dumb in the sense that she could not produce vocalization. Imagine the training difficulty with that. You could not talk to her. There was no way. And so in essence, what they had to go to was sign language. And I'm going to argue that the thing that really opens up language is when you know that you've made the link between the words and that to which the words refer. That is, you've made a link between the symbol and the referent, or that to which it refers. For most of us, that occurred sometime late in the first year, and nobody was overtly aware when it happened. Okay? But it did. It had to, or we wouldn't understand. We wouldn't be talking here today, because you would have no idea what this stuff I'm verbalizing relates to. You may not anyway. But the point is that before language will work for anybody, that link has to have been made. Anne Sullivan wrote a very compelling story of Helen Keller's life, and in it she describes the moment at which the abstract link was made. It's described at a moment when Helen and Anne Sullivan, the nurse who tended her on the estate on Long Island, were down at the pump house drawing water on the estate back in the early 1900s. And it's described as follows: the word, coming so close upon the sensation of cold water rushing over her hands, seemed to startle her. She dropped the mug and stood as one transfixed. A new light came into her face. She spelled water several times. Then she dropped to the ground and asked for its name, and pointed to the pump and the trellis. And suddenly turning round, she asked for my name. I spelled teacher. Just then the nurse brought Helen's little sister into the pump house, and Helen spelled baby and pointed to the nurse. All the way back to the house, she was highly excited and learned the name of every object she touched, so that in a few hours she had added 30 new words to her vocabulary. That burst occurred exactly because she made the link between the language, the shaping of her hands and the signs, and that to which the signs referred. Abstract reasoning is crucial to language. The final is a little more argumentative, and that is whether it is an inclined inclination or not. If I wanted to argue that it's an inclined inclination, that language is inherited, then I'm going to point out things like the fact that there is a very limited sound pool on which all of the world's languages are based. That is about 100 or 110 sounds. English, as it turns out, uses in the low 40s. Hawaiian uses less than half that number. And the result is that in Hawaiian, boulevard names and everything else have to be much longer because they have to string together a lot of la-las and ha-has to make a word that is unique, because they have fewer sounds with which to do it. The more sounds you have, the more efficient the language can be in terms of shorter sound units. But that's important. That is probably inherited. The idea that there is a constant sequence of development, which is the next topic we're going to get into here in a couple of minutes, is another argument that it is an inherited inclination. Thirdly, the fact that the sequence of not only the sequence, but the onset time of each of these stages is relatively constant worldwide. All of these, I'm going to argue, would allow you to argue persuasively that language is an inherited capability. On the other hand, I'm going to suggest that there are also some things that we could suggest that would argue that language is a learned attribute or feature, not inherited. For instance, no one learns language without practice. Without vocalizing, you cannot learn to speak, period. And secondly, the length of parent-child interaction all around the world is more than long enough for the necessary learning to occur for language to be transmitted. So is it inherited? Is it learned? The answer is probably, like many others in psychology, yes. That it's not likely to be one or the other. It's more likely to be a combination of both that leads to the ultimate mastery of language. But I'm going to argue that those are the four important attributes that we have to have in order to be able to speak a language. Now, let's look then at the development of language and start with a kind of a brief lifetime review of what goes on, a lifespan review. At birth, you've got two options. You can scream or you can be quiet. And that's it. But amazingly rapidly, infants begin to realize that how they vocalize very much impacts how people around them interact with them. You and I don't typically want to go up to a child who's not ours, who's screaming. We're much more likely to want to approach somebody who's first of all grinning, reflexively, and babbling or cooing, talking quietly and pleasantly. They're obviously happy at that point and things are good with them. Youngsters learn very rapidly. Hey, listen to this. Look what happens to mom when I scream. And I'll guarantee you, if you watch any parent whose youngster is under 5, anytime that youngster starts a vocalization that is A, loud, B, sudden in onset, and C, stressed, will cause that parent to stop whatever they're doing and go check the child. Because that's a scream for help. That's a scream of panic. That's a scream of danger or hurt. And that vocalization will attract attention immediately. In that combination of things and the pleasantries that are emitted when everything is going well, the youngster by even a month is already beginning to verbalize in a way that interacts or conveys to people what the problem is. Okay? My second wife is genius with youngsters. And in fact, she was more so even than my first wife, but both of them were very good at the fact that when the infant cried, they went to it immediately. Within a minute or two, they were always with the child, and the idea was that if a child is crying, or put it the other way, in the more positive, there's no reason for a child to cry. If it's fed, if its diaper's clean, if it's had enough to drink, it's fine, and it doesn't cry. And so basically a cry is an expression of help, and as we saw way back in the early theories in development, Erickson was arguing very specifically that the vocalization is there for a reason, and there's no reason for a youngster to have to cry if you'll cater to the signals when they come out. So in any case, by 3 months, they're babbling. They're already randomly emitting sounds. By 6 to 10 months, things are getting quite complex. One of the things that you're finding is, first of all, repetitive syllabification. The enunciation of ma or mama has become ma 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 ma, or da 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 da, or pa 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 pa, or any combination of consonant and vowel said many, many times. And in fact, exactly when the first word occurs is not necessarily identifiable for a couple of reasons. One is that it may just be that they're bursting into repetitive syllabification, and if they say mama and then start to cough, the mother immediately thinks, oh, it's a genius, I knew it. Look at that, he's calling me mama at age 7 months. No, it was just a repetitive syllabification that was cut short by a cough, and that's all. So we don't know when the first word actually occurs. A second thing, however, that is going on is imitation. And that is that if you listen to the sounds that are being babbled or repetitively syllabificated, if I can use that phrase, it very closely approximates the phonemes of the language that will become the youngster's first language. That is, to speak German, you have to retain the sound, as in the pronoun ich. We don't need that in English. That's the only phoneme used in producing German that is not used in English. And the result is babies who are going to speak English do not continue to syllabificate, and they don't imitate it. It drops out. The closest we come to it in English is the H sound in the word for color, or hue. But the is a much more pulled and forward sound than is ich, which is a much more guttural and backward sound in the mouth, further back in the sound. English babies drop that out. English babies that will end up speaking English drop that out, so that even the repetitive syllabification and the babbling are already imitating the sounds that will be needed for the production of the first word. And I'm going to argue that we never know when that first word actually occurs, because what makes it a word is intent. In other words, there has to be a deep structure there. There has to be an intended meaning. We are never going to know the first time that baby enunciates milk whether in fact it is saying, you spilled the milk, I want milk, the milk is boiling over, look at the milk, whatever. Because earlier than that, it was simply classical conditioning. Every time mom talks about that white fluid, she says milk. Well, I'm going to say milk when I talk about that white fluid. But until the intent to communicate is there, until that symbol referent link has been made, it isn't communication. It isn't a spoken word. And because of that, we can't be in the head of the youngster. And with the exception of Helen Keller, we typically are not aware when that link occurs. And yet, within a matter of 2 or 3 weeks, in most instances, the infant, by its production, has already told us now that it is in fact speaking, that I'm vocalizing in a way that you can understand and react to with some degree of understanding. Now, when we look at syntax, and I'll just get started on this, and then we'll have to come back and pick it up on the next lecture. What we're looking at, among other things, is the role of objects in our everyday life. And what I was really trying to get to here is to talk a little bit about the mean length of utterance, which is a not widely used concept in modern-day psycholinguistics, but I think it's an instructive one. Because in essence, what it talks about is the fact that once you and I start talking, we tend to string together words in several ways that are highly predictable. One is, once we start stringing a second, a third, a fourth meaning together, a fourth word together to get longer sentences, the time at which that happens may vary over a 15 or 18-month interval, as we'll see here. Well, in fact, I'll just give you the other two so you can see what I'm talking about. Here were 3 youngsters that were watched very carefully. And what you see here is, first of all, it starts in anywhere over a 12 to 18-month period. So when that stringing together is going to occur varies widely. The speed of increase is very steady for everyone, and yet the rate may vary tremendously. So that all of those are true of mean length of utterance. keep that curve in mind when we come back later and look at communication with chimpanzees, because we're going to find that the nature of chimpanzee communication, that is animal communication involving chimps, is argued about regarding the mean length of utterance. So keep those curves in mind when we talk next time about animal language.